In 2013, the United Nations reconvened a program to collect the history, oral history, and memories of the first delegates to the United Nations, formal delegates to the United Nations, who were invited by the UN. In 1977, the very first series of meetings that took place was an invitation by the United Nations to have the American Indians, both from Canada, it included Canada, North America, Latin America, and that is Central and Southern America, and all the Indian leaders at that time, or the nominated ones. And so they had a gathering in '77 and talked about Aboriginal issues. And of course, a lot of things flowed from that. Then in '81, the United Nations called a World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. And this World Conference brought together over 380 representatives from various regions of the world. And of course, the National Aboriginal Conference, having just completed a very successful international conference when they hosted the World Council of Indigenous People, which was chaired by Jose Carlos at that time. This was an organisation founded by George Manuel of Canada, Canadian Indian. And it was important from George Manuel's point of view that the Indigenous peoples of the world have a voice in politics at an international level. And because we all have a shared colonial history, then we needed to put our heads together to talk about the consequences of colonialism, its effect on our people, and the resulting trauma and loss that we suffered as a consequence of colonialism. And of course, the idea was to then for the UN to listen to how we wanted to make changes for the betterment of our people all over the world. And how do we deal with clawing back our claims to land, protection of our culture, developing our own economics, understanding our own laws and how they relate to the Western world, and of course locating our niche, our position in this modern world, and also defining what we classify as our rights. Now, the 2013 symposium, historical symposium of the first delegates, we talked about a number of issues, but the general idea of that meeting at that time, and this one, the second one, 2015, is to gain the historical knowledge, the oral history of why the people decided that they should go to the United Nations, why Aboriginal peoples feel it important, or if not important, why not, to participate in world affairs through the United Nations. And of course, so we've now coordinated a program where we included youth this time. And of course, as we talk about what was happening at the time in '81 77 and 81, and why we came. The youth were hearing some very, very disturbing things this time round, because they're hearing people from all over the world saying, what we came for back then is what we still argue for now. Yeah, we've made some gains in the form of UNDRIP, but a lot of the Indigenous people have also made it very clear that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has many flaws. And they recognise that there are flaws. They also recognise that we need to revisit it. But for now, we need to make states accountable. And so a lot of people see the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as a basis upon which governments should now build their relationship with Aboriginal peoples and observe those rights that are expanded upon and that have been defined in that document. Now, there are other issues as well that we spoke about, and there was other aspects of international law that merely build on and guarantees the rights that are in that declaration. Now, and that's basically the extent of our discussion, essentially, on the declaration. Yes, we did conclude that when we deal with the revision, the review of it, we then advance it and argue for it to become international law. So it's not an aspirational document, as Australia puts it, but rather that it does represent the law for the international community to observe, and so that we can then hold governments accountable through the legal process at an international level. But the beauty of this gathering, not only reflecting on our past struggles, the present, but the beauty was to have the young ones hear it firsthand, and also understand that there are still enormous frustrations that exist for those of us who have been involved in it for more than 50 years now. And to hear us say that, on the ground in our countries, whilst we may have achieved certain things at the United Nations level in terms of recognition of ongoing consequences of colonialism, the fact is that these young ones are now recording this oral history and getting it firsthand. And there's some really, really good stuff that's coming out. So that, and this is a database that will be developed within DOSIM, which works as a volunteer organisation to the United Nations in supporting Aboriginal peoples come together. And so their role right now is invaluable, and that the fact that the European Union are now backing it and supporting it shows that Aboriginal issues around the world are an important factor now in international the political arena, in particular as it relates to biodiversity, as well as the environment and climate change. Because from our perspective, we see the change in the land because we take notice through nature, not to barometers and scientific instruments. The most, I suppose, the greatest sign of climate change and differing environmental aspects of this change that's occurring, impacts on the animals, the insects, waters, the weather. And so now, and we said this at the meeting, we need to tell the world scientists and leading experts and governments what we know, what we see changing out there. We see animal behaviour, we see birds changing their direction and turning up in places they normally don't. We see fish behaviour patterns. You know, like when we were talking about over there, and you mentioned it, in fact, when I came home, because you heard this story about yellow bellies. Yeah. Now, it's rather ironic that, or a coincidence, I guess, more than coincidence, that we sat and listened to an old man say, I came to these United Nations to get help, and they haven't been able to help me. He was an Eskimo from the northern tundra above Alaska. They live out, so they live on the sea, out on those big ice blocks out there. They live where there's no tree or grass. Now, this old man, was talking about in his late 70s, and he's talking about all the things that he learned from his grandfather out there on the ice. And he's telling me how the ice growing back now in the summers, for the first time in certain areas when they come off the ice, they all of a sudden see green, how the ice melts further back up on the land than it normally did, by at least 50 metres. And he said that should never be. He said the normal circumstances, the ice would melt sufficient enough so that you just see the grass growing up through the ice. But he said now you've just got vacant land, there's no ice on the land. And he said that's when you used to see those birds come there to eat the growth, right, in amongst the ice. He said, but now you've got more birds there eating all that grass than ever before. And he said, we see birds there that we've never seen before. And he said, they are depleting the seeds and the grass that's there because there's so many of them turning up. And then he explained that how now multinational corporations right to now drill oil and do test drilling in the northern waters in the Arctic Circle. He was saying that it is on record that there is a massive pool of fish that's there that has not been fished out yet, where they've now issued massive numbers of fishing licenses for the fishermen to go up there and get all the big tunas and and he said the salmon runs, they'll take out the salmon. And he said what's going to happen is that this is where the remainder of 1/3 of the world's fish population is. And he said these fellas will make millions and millions of dollars from their catches, make them very rich, but they will deplete 1/3 of the world's remaining fish population. And he said there is no indication as to whether there are limits on catches. And he said that creates enormous problems for him and his people. But he made a warning to the Native Americans and Canadian Indians. He said, your eagles fly up there and catch a lot of the fish, the salmon, when they run. And he said that's their main diet. He said when the fish stop running, your fish will stop flying, your birds will stop flying. Your spiritual ancestor in that eagle will not be able to feed himself. And he said your stories will begin to disappear because there is no more fish. And he said, so what happens in the ocean affects the land in more ways than you can understand. And he was so poetic in terms of his, talk, in terms of saying, connecting the evolutionary process of the life cycle that we talk about. And he was saying, if the eagles can't get their feed, the eagles then will not breed. The population will begin to die from starvation. And he said, and so, like us, he said the eagle population will now drop, will commence to drop. And he said, so then the eagle, like us, will begin to fight for survival the same way we are. And he said their survival depends on us. He said their survival depends on us. And he said, so if they are important to your culture, well then you've got to look after the habitat and the environment that sustains the eagle. And he said, for us, there will not be enough feed, salmon and krill and others in the ocean to feed our seals and our orcas and whales. And he said they will begin to die from starvation. He said, I never ever thought that you could ever talk about a drought beneath the waters of the ocean. He said, but that's what will happen. He was very cool, this old man, the way he explained it all, And then he said the whales will travel and they will begin to open up new territories for themselves. And he said they in turn will become colonizers of the ocean and eat what is left beneath because they have to survive. And so then we begin to see the erosion, complete desecration of the life cycle. And he said, so white man is interfering with nature in more ways than anyone could imagine. This old Eskimo named George Edwardson, and he's going home this week. But the other thing that he came for as well, this time round, he was trying to find if the World Council of Churches still have a World Council of Churches. He said they have not been around for a long time. He said, so there's something wrong. Even the churches are falling apart and no longer have a sustainable representative body, it appears. Not like they used to. So they've given up. That was his point. Now, when we all talked about why we first went to the conference, I pointed out to them, they didn't record me on this, but they now want me to do a recording on it. I was telling them that after the NAC had hosted the WCIP, a lot of political pressure came on the NAC, a lot of political pressure, because of the nature of the submissions that we'd made to the World Council of Indigenous People. Because essentially we poured our hearts out and made it very clear that, our struggle was one of not political survival. Ours was cultural survival, survival of our identity, survival of us as a people. And that we needed our land and our culture and language to survive, for us to survive. And of course, if we were given the same rights as all other citizens in the country, then we should have had the right, and we would have been able to have the right to protect ourselves from this tyranny and the loss of culture and identity.